Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm Dan, and this is Forlorn Hobbies. Hello and welcome back to the channel. Now I'd like to apologise quickly for the length that it has taken for this video to come out. I have just been waiting for the audio to be recorded, and I thought you would prefer to have me not sounding like a Dalek, as bad as my normal voice is, so it's just taken a little bit longer than usual to get done. Now, on to the topic of today. So, it is finally time to revisit the Russian project for Eagles Under Glory 2 in March. Now, with just over a month to go, will I get this project done? Now, I'm not going to lie, I am quite concerned. I've had quite a lot of things crop up that have prevented me from doing as much as I would like, although I currently still believe that I will just about have enough time to get it all done. So, this video today will be focusing on the infantry that I will be taking to the event. Now, this is not going to be a straightforward painting guide. It's more of a kind of reflection on my thought process in kind of trying to find a balance between making sure everything is as accurate as I want it to be, but also just that time that it takes to get things ready. So it's all about trying to find that balance. I will also be reviewing the miniatures in question, just offering a few thoughts about that as well. So without further ado, let's move on to the product review itself. The miniatures that I have chosen to use for this project are predominantly from the Perry Miniatures range of metal Russians, because I tend to prefer metal miniatures, and ever since I saw the release of their Russians in greatcoats range, I have been waiting for an opportunity to do this project. So when the event came along, there was only really one choice for me. Now, besides the obvious bit of flash that comes on most metal models, which is very easy to remove by just scraping a knife or mold line remover along it and using some clippers, the models are very well detailed, which is obviously what you expect from the Perrys. Now, however, I don't know if it is a casting issue, but the greatcoats themselves on the line infantry are a bit rough in places, so that could be something to do with the release agent, but it kind of also adds to the flow a little bit, so it's not the end of the world. However, there are a couple of poses that you can see a noticeable split between the shako and the forehead of the miniature, which is kind of annoying when my kind of overall kind of theory when painting is faces and straps that I want to really kind of make pop to stand out when batch painting. So that was a little frustrating. However, the grenadiers are absolutely flawless in comparison, so it's just a little shame. Now, I could have chosen to just fill this in with some green stuff, but I don't really have time to inspect over 180 models and do that on every single one, so I'm just going to make the most of it where I can. Now, just looking at the miniatures as well, I've noticed that they are rather thin as well in their kind of build. Now, the Warlord Russians are very chunky in appearance, so they kind of suit a 20 by 20 millimeter frontage, whereas when I was kind of setting these up kind of just to see what kind of basing that I would be using, it became very clear that I would need to reduce the frontage to a 15 by 20 just to give it a much more knit together aesthetic that I was happy with. So unfortunately, this meant that I'm going to have to paint battalions of 32 instead of 24. Now the other thing that I will also be doing is adding in some grenadiers to each of my line battalions. So I had to kind of work out the numerical kind of what's the word? The numerical kind of percentage of that as well, and I settled on 8 grenadiers per 32 because historically the grenadiers represented about a third of the battalion. However, I felt that kind of 10 would make basing a bit of an issue, and then I also thought that it would make it look better when formed in column of attack to have the grenadiers flanking the command base, and it wouldn't overpower the unit as much. Once I had cleaned up the miniatures, I looked at ways to kind of help improve my batch painting, as I would be painting quite a lot of them, and I settled on using green stuff to stick them to the end of pencils that I had sawn off the pointy parts and put them in a pencil holder. Now I can use this to paint a battalion at a time, but have the battalion in that pencil holder so I'm not constantly picking up, changing painting handles. The pencil acts as a great handle, and I can just hold it, paint part, put it back, pick up the next one, and really increase my productivity as I go through. Now, I also needed to settle on a undercoat, like a primer for the miniatures, and for this I decided to go with Desert Sand from Colourforge because that was the closest colour to the predominant colour of the greatcoats which were on the miniature themselves. Now, there is a lot of contention amongst historical gamers as to what shade of brown, grey trench coats are in this kind of period, and in all respects we don't really know. There wasn't a huge consistency to dyeing, a lot of it was natural wall colours, so I decided to go with quite a light brown so that it would also reflect kind of the elements of the kind of weather around them. I envisaged a very cold kind of Russian weather where they were expected to wear their greatcoats for about 7 months of the year, from October through to May, because the climate was just so bad. Now, they're also a lot longer in the cut than the other European greatcoats of the time, so that really kind of blends in to making this miniature a lot easier to paint because there is less uniform detail on it as well. The first thing after priming is just to ensure that I give a good overall thin down coverage of an equivalent colour. This allows me to make sure that it is a neat consistency and to use it for any touch-ups that I would need to do at a later point. Now, looking at the kind of overall image, I was browsing the internet for very many historical kind of sources, and it seems from my research that after 1811 the greatcoat cuffs were supposed to be coloured, although this was not universally introduced, I decided that to break up the dullness of the brown, that I would have red collars and cuffs, because I find that contrast very striking in its appearance, and I would be applying this throughout all my battalions. Now, when it comes to details, there were markings to denote the 1st Battalion, or sorry, 1st Regiment in a brigade or division, where the kind of shoulder straps would be coloured accordingly. I think one was white, then red, then blue, possibly yellow. I think were the 4 regimental colours per division. I could be wrong, so please correct me in the comments. I had fully intended to do this on the miniature themselves, but after looking at the miniatures closely, the positioning of the straps were not visible on very many of them, to the point where it was worthwhile to paint these onto the miniatures. So I deliberately made the choice to omit this step from the painting process, because I just felt that all the kind of extra detail was going to be very time consuming for what it was actually worth. So coming up with a quickish kind of scheme that I was happy with as a result was kind of challenging, because obviously when you're painting a single miniature, your thought process is, oh, I'll just do this little bit more, and then, oh, I can do this little bit extra here, and before you know it, you can have a couple of layers, highlights on every little nook and fold of the cloak, and I just kind of had to rein myself in and kind of think sensibly. The total model count for this army is just over 350 figures, and I do not want to be highlighting buttons, every fold in the cloak. I mean, I can paint to that standard, but I do not want to paint to that standard on 350 models. If it was a single centerpiece model, it's very different to the rank and file troops that you might have. So I kind of made a painting plan to improve the effectiveness of my time. So I settled on all the base coats. I painted all the main areas, and most of the details in that were just blocked out with a flat colour. I then applied an overall shade to the whole miniature to blend everything together before picking out any major details, such as the faces and the straps. But because I am also enjoy making myself suffer, I then decided that I'm going to do a single layer stage on most of the steps that I've done, just to make it pop a little bit more. Now, when batch painting, this isn't necessarily an issue, because it also hides some of the blemishes. So like the brown on the cloaks, I felt that the wash knocked it back too dark in some places, so just going over with a thinned down layer of the original base coat just made it emphasize the folds and the recesses more, and gave it a much nicer finish. But the only real areas of detail that I paid attention to were the face, which had several layers of highlights, and the straps, which I then built up from a cold grey to a white in 2 stages. So it's not actually that time consuming. It was just making sure that I was neat and having a controlled brush, which was really the kind of main focus. Now, once I've painted a couple of the models through to completion, I'd kind of started to build up the muscle memory of it, so it made it a lot easier, and I'm now at the point where I can paint 6 or 7 in the time that it took me to originally paint the first 2 or 3. So I'm making good progress through the units. I'm currently looking at my hobby desk, and I've got at least 60 more line infantry in front of me at the moment in various stages of production. I tend to kind of batch paint in blocks of 4 or 8 just to kind of have some kind of organization to it. But I'm still enjoying painting the miniatures, which is the most important thing, I think. Once I was happy with the paint job, I sprayed them with matte varnish just to give them a little bit of protection, especially from all the handling, and I then based them, removing them quite easily from the pencil with some clippers, on 60 by 40 2mm thick MDF bases. Now that meant that I was basing them in 8s, which means that I've got 4 bases for the unit, which means that I can easily form square with them. I can put them in line and have them in column of attack quite easily, and not have to use individual models just to spend ages ranking them up. I also like to use movement trays, so again that will speed things up a lot quicker as well. So once I had put them on the bases, I then covered the bases with sand, as you know any hobbyist does, just to start that basing process. And my thought process was, I want this to represent the snowy, wintry fields of Russia. I don't want to go too heavy on the snow, so I painted up quite a cold, dark, dull earth colour as an undertone. Now, I always start off with cheap acrylics that you can buy from a thrift store, and just painted brown all over the sand, thinning it down a little bit. Now, this is where you need to be a little bit neat. However, I always, almost deliberately, like to get a little bit of the basing paint on the hems of the greatcoats of the models, because this allows me to just build up some natural weathering, and I find, especially when multi-basing, that this is a lot quicker doing it this way than weathering each and every model individually. So it will look like you've ruined the model to begin with, but obviously it's just having a little bit here or there, so don't be alarmed. And then I dry brushed a couple of layers over the sand, building up to like a kind of a bone colour, very fine dry brush. But whilst I was dry brushing the sand, I also used the dry brushes to blend in the weathering effect into the greatcoats. Once I was happy with that, I then applied some frozen tufts. I think these ones are from Army Painter. And then I applied some Valhallan Blizzard Snow Mix texture paint from Citadel in small areas, just to give it a nice kind of overall blend to the basing. Once the basing is dry, the battalion is done, except for the flags. Now I will do a separate quick and easy video on how I go about doing my flags, which should be out in the next week or so. But I've added the 1st Battalion of the Alexipol Regiment flag to this particular battalion, and I've decided to add the flags last, just so it allows me to have a bit more kind of visibility and access to all the areas of the base, because it is quite difficult just to get into that middle area between the front rank and the second rank as it is without the flags, so I didn't want to just knock them off and have it chipping and all that. So I just thought I'll do it at the end. All it takes is a little bit of super glue just on a brush, just brushed onto the hands, and they are perfect to be just dropped in place. And with that, the battalion is done, and this is the final result. So, as always, I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope to see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. Until next time, enjoy your hobby.